Potamoi emerged from the swamp, rage pulsing from their eyes, and Nemesis prepared for an attack. Pulling her sword from her sheath, Nemesis held it in front of her, defensively. These Potamoi were being done an injustice. They needed to be defended as much as she did. Of course, as she wielded her sword against the vines, which were thrust at her violently, it was clear that the Potamoi would not think twice before spilling her blood. Nemesis danced and parried each attack, the vines bouncing off and wrapping around her sword. Flurries of stinging needles showered her as Nemesis ducked, blocked, and thrust away. Many of the needles were deflected, some of them stuck in her armor, and a few of them sunk into her skin. Where they entered her body, a burning sensation emerged, and her mind blazed with the pain. Nemesis resisted the urge to cry out, using the pain to fuel her defense. Looking out, she saw the two Potamoi, algae green and clothed in vines, advancing toward her, eyes filled with darkness. A third attacker came out of the foliage, striking a direct line toward where Hecate was meditating. Nemesis dove quickly into her path, blocking the advancement. The Potamide snarled at her and reached for her face. Nemesis dodged her touch, sinking near to the ground and sweeping the Potamide's legs out from under her. She began to fall, but danced and regained her footing as Nemesis rose, driving her shoulder into the Potamide's torso. The Potamide doubled over and sank to the ground, panting. Before Nemesis could turn and face another attacker, 2 sets of fingers were placed on her shoulders. Vines wrapped under her armpits, between the gaps in her armor, grazing at her flesh. She was unable to prevent the scream this time, as she was forced to her knees, her body burning with an unearthly pain, administered from the outside, but somehow originating inside. Reluctant tears filled her eyes as more vines began to wrap around her, pushing her downward to the ground. She saw 4 Potamoi staring down at her in a blind rage, preparing to eliminate her. No matter how Nemesis pulled away from the ground, the vines held her even tighter. No matter how she resisted, the force holding her down only increased. No matter how she searched, she could see nothing but sadism in the Potamoi's eyes. No matter how she tried to ignore it, she could not block out Prospero's mocking laughter. The Potamoi each extended a hand toward her, and the vines began to advance from them, toward her face. Nemesis closed her mouth tightly, knowing that this would have little effect. The vines would find an opening, and they would tear her apart, savagely, until her body was unrecognizable. She would decompose and become one with the swamp, her quest for justice coming to an end. Nemesis closed her eyes, tears burning as they dripped down her cheeks, and made peace with the situation. The strike never came. The pressure holding her down weakened, then vanished. The laughter changed to frustrated orders as Prospero commanded the Potamoi to kill her. Nemesis opened her eyes in confusion, seeing the Potamoi standing around her, appearing disoriented. Remaining on the ground, Nemesis took a moment to peer into a sky that she had never thought to see again as she tried to figure out what had happened. Almost immediately, her answer came as Hecate's innocent smile appeared over her head encircled by a halo of sunlight. She offered her hand, and Nemesis accepted it, standing to her feet. Shaking her head, she tried to orient her thoughts. "The spell," was all that she could think to mutter, still shaken from the attack. Hecate nodded. "The spell," she confirmed. "It was a tremendously intricate thing, but once I figured out the idea behind it, it was not all that difficult to modify. All I needed to do was—" Nemesis lay a weary hand on Hecate's shoulder, cutting her off. She sighed as she smiled tiredly. "Perhaps now is not the moment for you to explain your technique to me," she said. "Right you are," Hecate laughed. Nemesis heard sounds all around her, gentle rustlings and sounds of emergence. Looking out, she saw Potamoi, dozens of them, coming from the swamp and out of the quagmire. Their eyes were no longer filled with blind rage, changing instead to a very focused hatred. There was very little question as to who the focus of that emotion was. "No!" Prospero screamed. "You will not strike me! I have made you compliant!"